Hi, my name is David Kelsey, and today we're going to discuss the philosophy of religion. So today we'll be discussing several arguments for theism, which is the belief that God exists. We will look at two cosmological arguments for God's existence and one teleological argument for God's existence. The cosmological argument is about causation. So all cosmological arguments have a basic form to them, which is something like this. There is something that causes everything else, and this is what we would call a first cause. And only God, of course, could be that first cause, so therefore God exists. All teleological arguments are about design or purpose, and they're usually something to the effect that there's design in the universe. The world is like a machine, something like this. Therefore, because machines must have a designer of some kind, then of course that designer is God, right, for the universe. So we're going to be talking about St. Thomas Aquinas' cosmological and teleological arguments for God's existence. Aquinas lived from 1225 to 1274, and he writes in his famous work called Summa Theologica what he calls his 5 ways. The 5 ways are his 5 different, he gives us 5 different arguments for God's existence, and he calls those the 5 ways. The first way we're going to look at, it is a cosmological argument for God's existence. And the first premise of the argument that Aquinas gives us is that things change. By this premise, what Aquinas means is that there is movement or change in the universe. So, for example, he's talking about the change that occurs when you throw a baseball or when you drive a car, right? It's just the change that occurs when something moves in the universe. And of course, this occurs all over the place. The second premise that Aquinas gives us is a kind of definition of that change. And so what he says, what Aquinas says is that this kind of change occurs, movement occurs when something that is potential becomes actual. Okay? So what he means by this is for example, take my hand, right? My hand is up, right? And that's what Aquinas would say is actually the case. My hand is raised up, right? And then, of course, potentially, my hand could be all sorts of other ways. For example, my hand could be down, right, to the side like this. Or it could be raised up really high, right? Or it could be pointed down to the ground, right? And what Aquinas says is that when one of those potential ways that my arm is becomes actual, becomes the truth, right? Then that is change. So, for example, I have my hand raised up, and it is potentially raised up really high, right? So it's potentially raised up really high. When that potential of being raised up really high becomes actual, then that's change. So we have change there, right? The potentiality of my hand being raised up really high has become actual, and so we have change occurring, right? Okay, so what Aquinas then says, his third premise, is that whenever we have change like that, anything that changes like that, it must be caused to change by something else, right? And so what he means here is that consider, for example, something like a baseball, right? Say, for example, that I were to throw a baseball from the pitcher's mound to the batter, right? And so I throw the baseball toward the batter so he can hit it, right? The only way that baseball can change, so says Aquinas, is when some outside force, something other than the baseball itself, causes it to change. So, for example, if a batter, right, this batter hits the ball and it goes, say, it comes back at me and say goes over the fence and becomes a home run or something like this, right? That, of course, would be change upon the baseball. And that can only occur when something like the batter hits the ball with the bat, right? So what he says here is that change occurs only when some outside force, something else, causes that baseball to move the other direction, right? Okay, so then the fourth premise that he gives us is a really, this is quite complex, so we need to kind of concentrate on this for a bit. So he says, there couldn't be an open causal chain of changing changers going back forever into the past. You know, that's of course quite a mouthful. So what he means, first off, he's talking about here what we would call an open causal chain of changing changers. So I always, when I discuss this point, I always try to get you to think about, the student to think about the idea of a chain of dominoes, right? So imagine a chain of dominoes, right? And you have one domino knocking over the next, right? And imagine that you have this kind of string of dominoes where you have this causal chain, one causing the next to fall and so on, right? Now, an open causal chain, the idea there is that imagine this domino, this string of dominoes, right, without a beginning. So imagine that were to go on forever and ever into the past, right? And what Aquinas is saying here is that is not possible. It is not possible to have this kind of causal sequence, like this string of dominoes that just doesn't have a beginning, right? And his argument is really, really simple. He says without a beginning, right, without something to initiate that sequence, then of course, right, if nothing is able to push the first domino over, then of course the second domino doesn't fall. And of course if the second domino doesn't fall, then neither does the third. And if the third doesn't, neither does the fourth, and so on. So without something to initiate the sequence, without something to cause the first domino to fall, none of the rest of the dominoes fall. So of course what Aquinas thinks is that this entails that there has to be a first cause of the sequence, right? Something to initiate the sequence to move, something to push the first domino over to get the chain going. So of course then what Aquinas says is that there must be some first cause of change, something to knock that first domino over, but what a first cause is something to knock the first cause over, but the first cause itself isn't caused to change by anything else. So somehow there is a cause of the sequence of dominoes, right? That causal sequence that sets off the chain. But at the same time, though, Aquinas thinks that nothing itself causes that first cause to move or to change at all, right? So somehow that first cause causes all the change in the dominoes, and yet isn't caused to change by anything else. And of course, what Aquinas thinks is that only God could be this first cause, right? And only God could be the one to sort of set off the dominoes without he or she, him or herself being caused to change by anything else. And so this, of course, is said to be the proof that God exists. So this would be the first way, Aquinas' first argument for God's existence. So continuing on then, we have this question about the first way, and the question is why couldn't there be more than one first cause, right? Aquinas suggests that because basically this causal sequence that we see in the universe had to be caused by a first cause, right? Something that set the motion, the chain of events that we see today, and yet couldn't itself have been caused by anything else, right? The question then is, why couldn't there be more than one of those, right? Aquinas thinks that, we have one first cause that set off the universe, but it certainly seems quite plausible that there could be more than one. For example, as support to this point, for example, consider something like what we see when, a car is created, or another machine like, say, a computer is created, right? We have a whole string of people involved in the creation, in the causation of things like computers and cars. So you might ask why there couldn't just be more than one first cause of the universe, and hence more than one God, right? And so that's the first sort of question that we ask about Aquinas' argument. Although it suggests there's a first cause, there's no reason to rule out the fact that there could be more than one. Okay, so moving on to the second point then, the second question we have about Aquinas' argument is, of course, Aquinas suggests that this first cause is God, right? Well, why couldn't this first cause be something else, right? What Aquinas is arguing here is that the first cause is just a cause of the universe, right? But why couldn't the cause of the universe, in a certain sense, the thing that sets off the causal sequence that we see today, why couldn't that be something like a universal force, like gravity, right? Why need it be God, right? And really, the notion of God is really, it seems to be much more than just the first cause. It seems to be, right, our creator, right? And God seems to be something like something that's all powerful and good and all knowing and so on. And there's really nothing in the idea of a first cause that suggests any of that, right? And so, just in virtue of Aquinas' argument, we just don't seem to get to the idea of God that we see, for example, in Christianity. We just seem to get to something instead that's just maybe a force that causes the universe, right? And that, of course, could be something like gravity or a universal force that's explained by something like physics. The third criticism that suggests itself regarding this argument has to do with a contradiction that seems to form between premise 3 and premise 5. So consider that premise 3 says that everything that causes change must be caused to change by something else. Now consider premise 5, which says that there's a first cause of change. Note that a first cause of change isn't caused to change by anything else. So the very idea of a first cause of change cannot be true if premise 3 is at the same time true, right? A first cause of change by its very nature isn't caused to change by anything else. It's just something that causes change in other things without itself being caused. And yet premise 3 says that's not possible because everything is caused to change by another, right? So essentially, if premise 3 is true, premise 5 must be false. And of course, if premise 5 is true, premise 3 must be false. So Aquinas cannot have both of these at the same time. So the argument seems to sort of implode on itself here, right? Now, I think the way that Aquinas would respond here is really the only way to respond is by saying that somehow premise 3 here, that everything is caused to change by another, doesn't apply to God, right? And of course, it's kind of makes sense that, if anything is sort of excluded from this principle that everything that's caused to change by another, if anything is excluded from a principle like that, it would of course be God. And so that seems to be the way out for Aquinas. But nevertheless, it doesn't seem like you can have both premise 3 and premise 5 at the same time as they're stated. And so it seems like we would have to, at least to get Aquinas out of this kind of pickle, if you will, we would have to alter premise 3 to say something like, everything is caused to change by another except God, right? Something like this. So the argument's going to have to change. Okay, so that would be the first way, and then, sort of all the problems that are created for the first way. And as you can see, it's not an easy escape for Aquinas on any of those points, all right? Okay, so moving on then, we're going to now talk about the fourth way. And this would be Aquinas' fourth argument for the existence of God. Again, this is a rather tricky argument with tricky wording. And what we'll see about this fourth way is that there is one premise in particular that stands out as really, really problematic. And I think for Aquinas to really defend this argument, he would have to say something in defense of this particular premise, which we'll discuss here in a minute. But the way the fourth premise goes, he says, first and foremost, he says, some things are good and noble and true, right? So he says, look out into the world and we see goodness out there and truth, right? And then he says, look, in comparison, you can see if you look out in the world that some things are better than others, right? For example, we might see more goodness in one thing than another, or more beauty, say, in one thing than another, right? For example, I might see more beauty in a sunset than in a monster truck rally, right? So he says premise 2 is sort of to say that just there's this kind of comparable nature about things that we see out in the world, right? Okay, so then in premise 3, he says the better things that we see, right? Some things are better than others. Some things are more beautiful than others or more good than others, right? All those things that are better have more of that quality with respect to some maximum, right? So a sunset is more beautiful than a monster truck rally, but of course we can see things that are even more beautiful than a sunset and so on. And then of course what Aquinas is saying is that there's a kind of maximum amount of beauty that we're comparing that sunset to, right? So then premise 4 he gives us, well then of course that suggests there's a maximum to goodness, to truth, to beauty, to qualities like this, right? But then premise 5 he gives us, he says, and this is a sort of the questionable one, he says, whatever is maximally good is the cause of whatever else that's good, right? So he says, Aquinas thinks here, for example, he gives us this kind of example of fire. What Aquinas says is that whatever is hot is caused to be hot by whatever is maximally hot, right? And whatever is good is caused to be good by whatever is maximally good, right? Now, assuming that premise to be true, he says then in premise 6 that therefore there is something that's maximally good, and of course that causes everything else that's good, and then of course that suggests the idea of God, right? Now the interesting thing about this argument is that if you think about the idea of something that's maximally good, that sounds a lot like God. And so this argument does really seem to suggest, maybe more so than Aquinas' first way, that God is real and God exists, right? But we have really a big problem with this argument, and that it comes with premise 5. So in premise 5, Aquinas tells us that whatever is maximally good is the cause of whatever else that's good. And then of course he gives this example of fire, right? Whatever is maximally hot is the cause of whatever else that's hot. Now, if you think about why Aquinas says this, you can understand why he's saying it. So Aquinas was a kind of big fan of Aristotle, the philosopher Aristotle. And in Aristotle's day, this is kind of what Aristotle thought. Aristotle and the Greeks, the other Greeks and the Greek philosophers and scientists all thought that in the universe there were 4 elements, right? And the elements were fire and water, air, and earth, right? Those were the 4 elements. And of course, so then it seems like it would follow that if there was a fire element, right, then of course that fire element would be the cause of all things that were related to fire and all things that were hot, right? And so this explains why Aquinas would think, and Aristotle would think, that the maximum of something would cause everything of that element, that kind, right? Of course, now we know this to be false, right? There is no fire element. There's no earth or water element, right? There are, in fact, these elements that we have defined by chemistry and physics and so on that tell us that the universe is very, very different, right? Now, to go on further, why would we want to say then, and really this is the crux of the issue, why is this premise that whatever is maximally good is the cause of whatever else that's good? Why would we think that's false? Well, it's really simple. Consider the property of heaviness, right? Apply this kind of principle to things that are heavy, right? According to Aquinas, what is heavy in the universe should be caused to be heavy by the maximum heavy thing, right? Whatever's the most heavy thing in the universe, right? And if we consider that idea, it seems to be very, very false, right? Why? Because what causes something to be heavy, we know, is mass and gravity, right? The cause of what's heavy isn't sort of like the maximum heavy thing in the universe, say some galaxy or cluster of galaxies, right? That might be considered to be the heaviest thing in the universe, maybe something heavier, right? That doesn't have anything to do with what makes something heavy. Instead, it's how much mass it has and then how much gravity is being applied to that. So we can see quite clearly that his premise that the maximum of something causes everything else of that kind is clearly seems to be quite false, right? And I think it's just a matter of the science that we see from the 4th, 5th century BC that Aristotle gives us is just false, right? There isn't just 4 elements in the universe, and fire just clearly isn't the cause of everything that's hot, right? Okay, so then that would be the main problem with the key problem, and I think really, the only problem that we need to discuss with Aquinas' fourth way. It seems to be clearly, problematic argument and something that would need a good defense to show otherwise, right? Okay, then moving on, we have now, we're going to discuss now Aquinas' fifth way. Now, Aquinas' fifth way, unlike the first and the fourth way, Aquinas' fifth way is what we would call a teleological argument for God's existence. And a teleological argument for God's existence is based on the concept of design, right? And we're going to actually look at, although Aquinas gives us the fifth way, and this is this famous teleological argument for God's existence, we're going to look at David Hume's translation of Aquinas' fifth way. And David Hume gives us the teleological argument in a slightly more simple, less complex, and it's actually quite beautiful, his translation of the fifth way. So Hume tells us that, first, the world is like a machine. So by this premise, what Hume means is that if you look around the world, you'll notice that things look a bit like, say, a watch or a computer or a car, right? You see design and purpose throughout the universe. So examples that seem to show this, for example, I like to think about the idea of an ecosystem, right? In an ecosystem, you have everything kind of surviving and feeding off something else, and they all need each other to survive, right? And so that looks a bit like a machine. Another example I think that's quite good is something just as simple as our solar system, right? Our solar system, if you think about it, it looks a bit like a kind of machine, right? Everything, revolving, orbiting around the sun, and everything times out pretty well, and it all just seems a bit too organized, right? A bit too much like a pattern and design there. Okay? The last example I'll give of the machine-like nature of the universe is the human body, right? And sort of biological principles like this. So in the human body, we have the heart that pumps the blood. We have, of course, the blood. We have the veins. The blood pumps through and runs through. We have the kidneys that filter the blood and so on. And so it looks like, everything kind of functions for a purpose, right? It looks a bit like a machine, right? Now, the next premise that Aquinas and Hume gives us here, Hume in particular gives us here, is that machines are created by designers, right? So if you look at, for example, something like a watch or a clock or a computer or a car, right, you have these designers, right? These intelligent designers, these people that create these machines, right? And then, of course, analogously, if machines are created by designers and the world is like a machine, then it seems like it would follow that the world then has a designer, which is God. Okay? Now, of course, with this argument, we have here an argument by analogy, right? The analogy is between a machine like a watch and the universe, right? And they're both said to be like machines, and so since the watch is designed, so too is said to be the universe, right? Now, whenever you have an argument by analogy, the quickest and easiest way to challenge the argument is to challenge the analogy itself, right? So what you want to ask about this argument, is there any way in which the universe and something like a watch or a computer aren't analogous? Is there any way in which there's a disanalogy there, in which there's sort of a relevant difference, right? Of course, we might just say something as simple as, well, if the universe is like a watch, it would, of course, be significantly greater as far as complexity and size and just the design involved, right? And so in that sense, maybe it's as simple as challenging the analogy in terms of just the complexity of the analogy, right? The complexity of the terms of the analogy, right? Very, very different. Now, we might just think about if we really take the analogy seriously, right? As another way of criticizing this argument, if we take the analogy seriously, we might consider the analogy in a real serious type of way. And if we just think about, for example, the fact that if you look at something like a watch or a car, these are created by human beings. And human beings are, for example, imperfect. Human beings are, for example, sometimes corrupt, right, or evil. And so if you take this analogy seriously, then that suggests that God is, say, imperfect or corrupt or immoral, just like human beings are. But of course, that's not the kind of God that we would want the argument to suggest, right? And so what this tells us about this argument is it doesn't quite get us far enough. It doesn't get us to the God that we all think of as, good and right and knowledgeable and so on, right? Secondly, again, this argument suggests, another problem suggests itself, which is that, oftentimes machines, again, are created by many, many people, right? Again, computers and cars and so on are created in factories, right, with many, many people involved in their design and their creation. So then, of course, if you follow the analogy and take the analogy seriously, that suggests maybe then, of course, that there's many gods, right, which is, again, something that we don't really, want the argument to suggest. So again, this suggests that the argument really doesn't quite get us far enough, right? And I think as far as the argument goes as well, there are other ways to criticize Aquinas' fifth way, and of course Hume's interpretation of it. But I think that's probably enough for now. Again, if you take the analogy seriously, it does seem like there's some problems that suggest themselves about the fifth way. But on the other hand, if you take the argument for what it is, right? The argument is an inductive argument, an argument by analogy to prove that God exists. The argument actually seems kind of compelling, right? It does seem a bit like there's design in the universe, and it does seem a bit like, God would be the designer, right? Okay, so that'll do it for our lecture on St. Thomas Aquinas and his 5 ways, and the lecture on the Introduction to Philosophy of Religion. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.